AskReddit by Weird John. Older editors, what do young people get completely wrong about past decades? Up until video rental stores in the early 80s, at school the next day every kid was talking about what was on TV the night before, as every single family was watching TV together every single night. With some exceptions, most people watched the same thing as their schoolmates or co-workers, just to be a part of the conversation. There's something very isolating about modern media. You can be into a TV show or YouTube series, and nobody else you know has heard of it. I'm a fan of a YouTube series that's pretty popular and very well regarded amongst its fans, and only one of my friends has heard about it. Edit, for people asking, it's red letter media. Probably just how often you had to accept that you couldn't find out the answer to something. If you had a question you could ask your family, maybe your friends, maybe your teachers, and your last chance was to check the library. But if the library didn't have the answer, then you just had to accept that you weren't going to get an answer, or you'd have to hope to come across that answer someday in the future. Now you just ask Google and get 10 answers in just seconds. Kids used to rely on that for so much fun bullshit. Like that one classmate who always made an outrageous claim allegedly passed to them by some uncle who worked in some exciting industry or field, and you could either believe them or not. You certainly couldn't look up the truth. How on time you had to be for your favorite shows because there was little to no chance you'd see that same episode again until they, hopefully, did reruns during summer. I remember waiting anxiously for the nightly news to be over so I could watch my favorite TV shows. Commercial breaks were just mad rushes for the bathroom, or to the kitchen to get something quick to drink. Hollering through the house to your sibling, it's starting. That it was incredibly common to just not have pictures of events or other things we see as important now. Not only did we have entire vacations where no pictures were taken, we could go months without a single picture being taken of any member of our family unless it was particularly notable. A trip to St. Louis? No pictures. A trip to Disneyland? Maybe a picture at the entry gate or one of the souvenir pictures of us with a character. A trip to zoo? No pictures. An average day? Forget about it. Frequently, the only pictures taken were at major holidays like Christmas or on someone's birthday. There are so few pictures of me growing up it's hilarious. Compared to my daughter whose every waking moment seems to have been captured. They understand restaurants had smoking sections and that bars and amp clubs were filled with cigarette smoke. But I don't think many understood how pervasive smoking was. There were ashtrays and people smoking literally everywhere. Jury boxes had ashtrays in front of every juror. Judge smoked, lawyers smoked, the gallery smoked. You smoked on planes, trains, buses, taxicabs, and all transportation centers. You smoked at the library, the PTO meetings at schools, the town hall and all city offices. Hell, you could smoke at the courtyard at my high school as a student. You smoked in the elevator and on the escalator. The mall. Sports venues. Doctors' offices. Hospitals. The movies. The plays, opera, concerts and every other public performance. A non-smoker would come home often smelling like smoke. One was constantly surrounded by smoke. It was insane. You literally made ashtrays as a grade 1 art project, that's how common it was. How common drinking and amp driving was. Until MADD came along, people did this routinely. It's where one for the road originated. Deleted. Landline telephones had seriously great audio quality. Better than anything for remote conversation today, in my opinion. I distinctly remember being a teenager and just talking on the phone with someone late into the night, hearing them breathe and sigh, hearing their every little sound. There wasn't the lag and the noise cancelling and the high compression that ruins telephony today. It was a much purer way to feel like you were closer to someone than anything we have today. Honestly, it's shocking how poor the mic quality is on even high-end modern smartphones. We had so much better on landlines phones as a rule. How hard it was to get porn. You had to go buy it in person. Mail order porn was a possibility, but then the postman knows. They always knew. When I was about 11-12, our crew were riding our bikes out of the neighborhood and found a paper grocery bag full of old Playboys by the side of the main road. Thought we hit the lottery for a bunch of pubescent boys. We hid them in the woods until they finally fell apart. People say that the 80s were all about consumerism, which is true, but the products were well made and fixable. Towns had repair shops for everything. You just didn't buy a disposable TV. If it broke, you took it in to get fixed. Nowadays, if your TV breaks, it's tossed and you get a new one. Edit. TVs are just one example that I used. Look at many different examples under the comments, for example shoes, household appliances, cars, etc. Yep, working in computer repair, computer and phone companies realized they'd make more money if they made it as difficult as possible to fix. But people started realizing that, so we're fighting the right to repair fight. The 80s was not day glow. The 80s was brown and grey with a dash of pastel towards the end. Early 80s still had brown, orange, yellow fashion from the late 70s, then pastels took over. So much brown. Deleted. The front desk guy at the gym, who is 20 years old, told me I was the youngest looking middle-aged person he'd ever seen. I'm 36 lol. I just laughed because I remember how old that seemed to me when I was 20. Maybe not everyone's experience, but for me there was casual violence everywhere. Smacking kids was not only tolerated but expected. Hit by parents, friends' parents, random adults in the neighborhood, teachers, etc. Then you'd get beat for making the teacher hit you. What will the neighbors think was real? When I was growing up, I had friends whose parents beat them almost bloody. To the point where they couldn't come to school the next couple of days. I fucking hated elementary school teachers who'd call their parents for bullshit stuff and thought they were being dramatic when they'd beg and plead to not call their parents. Honestly, I think some knew and liked my friends begging to them. Travel. Reading paper maps and scanning for roadsides and landmarks to guide you to destinations you have never been to. Half of my younger co-workers couldn't point north if asked without their phones. Deleted. 9/11. Younger people don't truly understand how the entire nation froze in shock. Security was never the same. For example, traveling via air was never the same afterwards. I missed the days of walking my friend's family to the gate and drop them off. They don't understand that essentially nothing has been the same since, and everything this country is going through right now can in some way trace a through line directly back to the effects that 9/11 had. Kids think Y2K was a joke, but the panic was real. People legit thought computers would end us. Looking back more than 2 decades, it feels like Y2K was a whole lot of fuss over nothing, but that's because there were so many people working behind the scenes to fix things in the months and years leading up to it that did take it very seriously. At the time, my dad worked as a computer programmer for a fairly large bank, and his whole department had been focusing for almost 2 years, knowing that there were lots of little things that could have ended up disastrously wrong. They did numerous offline drills with backups of the bank's data in the weeks leading up to it, and were fairly confident that they had patched and updated all of the code, but my dad and his department all had to come into the office on New Year's Eve to be ready to fix things if something unexpected broke. Fortunately, everything worked as planned, and the evening basically turned into a catered party for him and the other programmers. How pop culture amalgamates shit into one big blob, when in reality, it pisses out in little dribbles over decades until it's distilled by time. Lots of young folks in movie subreddits will talk shit about older movies when they finally watch them, and complain that it's not even that good. Why did anyone like it? And they have legitimately zero understanding that at the time, that was the only movie about X or Y that anyone had seen, ever, and so yeah, it actually was pretty fucking exciting. Also, how rare it was to be able to watch media like TV or movies repeatedly. It just wasn't a thing. You missed a show? Too bad. Good luck catching a rerun at some point later. Really liked a movie? Well, it's out of theaters, so you can't watch it again until maybe it gets edited and played on TV. So many people just didn't have VCRs. The way we consumed entertainment 100% does not exist anymore, and it really did inform how we interacted with it. There's a reason movie novelizations were a lot more popular before VCRs were common. Deleted. My friends and I left the house on our bikes on Saturday morning, rode all over town, played by the river, grabbed lunch at whatever kid's house we were at, and went back out again. We landed at home for dinner and then went back out until the street light came on. I don't think people today realize the lack of organized entertainment and lack of any electronics. We had almost endless freedom. It was wonderful. That all late 80s and 90s music was good. There was plenty of crappy music released then, like there is now. It's just that the crappy music got buried quickly while the best hits continue to get played today. Survivorship bias. Achy breaky heart was bigger than Nirvana ever was. How self-sufficient you had to be. If you got a flat tire, you had to change it yourself or walk. You had to make arrangements to meet up with friends well ahead of time and then show up. The world before cell phones was completely different. Funny how so many older Redditors, I'm 53, are ignoring the question and waxing nostalgic. Here's my answer, OP. I think many young people see the decades I grew up in through the lens of survivor bias, and only know the cool fun stuff. The mediocre crap that made up the mainstream has been forgotten. In other words, no, most teenagers were not listening to REM and The Cure in the 1980s. They were into Richard Marx and Starship. While I do miss some aspects of the era of my youth, there have since been many advancements in general quality of life that more than make up for this lost so-called simplicity. That feminism isn't some moldy concept from the distant past. In the US, sexual discrimination in education wasn't outlawed until 1972, which just happened to be the same year unmarried women were legally allowed access to birth control. Additionally, prior to 1974, women were not allowed to have credit cards or loans in their own names. They were simply authorized users of their husband's credit cards. Some employers also required married women to have their husband's permission before they were offered employment. When people talk about how women in the 1950s and 1960s stayed married even when the marriage was clearly rocky, it was less about devotion and more to do with the lack of equal access to education, work and finances. The divorce rate skyrocketed in the 70s, but not because women were suddenly wanton and looking for a good time. It was because they were no longer forced to remain in a bad marriage as a matter of financial survival. Deleted. Smoking and DUI. I'm 44 years old. But here are some things for context. We used to have ashtrays on grocery carts in my lifetime. People smoked in the grocery store. Every fast food restaurant used to have little tinfoil ashtrays for their tables. Everyone smoked in their homes. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't vilified. To this day, signs outside businesses that say you can't smoke outside on the sidewalk weird me out. Drinking and driving. My dad told me a story about getting pulled over when he was too drunk to stand up one night. Maybe 1980. The cop followed him home to make sure he got there safely. It wasn't until 1982 that MADD made DUI a political issue. Before then, it just wasn't a big deal. Sexuality and nudity was far more pervasive in media than it is today. In the 80s there were a lot more R-rated movies that were focused on losing your virginity and hooking up, and I feel there was much more pressure on teens to be sexually active, and if you weren't scoring with members of the opposite sex you were considered a nerd. Just how unimportant politics felt. A lot of people only paid attention to politics every couple of years and only for a few weeks. Whoever won or lost, not that much was going to change and you could move on with your life. The big shock of 2000 was that an otherwise dull election about nothing turned on the very narrowest of margins. So did the Senate and the House. Then the country went nuts after 9/11. Local politics mattered more to people. They were more invested on a personal level with their local representatives. It didn't matter as much who was Republican or Democrat. People regularly voted for either party. I'm 53 years old. I have never, ever been able to afford living on my own without financial support from a partner or roommate, and vice versa. None of my peers had their own apartment or house or whatever. Costs were always split with someone else. I mean, I could afford to do it now, but that's after 35 years of working full-time. AIDS killed. Measles killed. Malaria killed. Polio existed. Rubella killed. Smallpox killed. These are now controlled, eliminated, or eradicated. Journalism has changed. You used to be able to trust in the integrity of the journalist. Now, they're interchangeable, and all we know is the network. It has changed the way we trust the new media, and it's not good. We shouldn't underestimate the danger of this change. Journalism half the shit people are feeding themselves these days doesn't have an editor. You're lucky if they run a spell check. I love the meme where people post a bedroom that looks like Cafe 80s from BTTF, and the text reads what people think the 80s were like. And then the next image is the most dingy brown, wood-paneled shithole ever, and it says what the 80s actually looked like. People seriously discount the foulness of 1980s smoked out houses. Non-smokers didn't spend time on porches because of the ambience, they did it to escape the soot. The internet. Used to be cool, now it's a fucking cesspool of literal bullshit. The internet when I was a kid was fucking sick. Now everything is an ad or feels like an ad. Back then people were just doing it for fun. They believe that you could support a family on minimum wage. I was working minimum wage in the early 1970s and it was nowhere near enough to live on my own, much less have a house and a family. There is some misconception that the smiling family of man, woman, and 2 kids lived happily in a large home with everything they needed on a pittance of a factory worker's salary. There may have been a brief window of time following WWII, when the entire international community's production force had been decimated besides the US, that there was even a semblance of reality to this myth. Otherwise, remember that the US labor movement was created because how bad conditions were, how little workers were paid, and how hard life was. Large families live in packed tenement buildings with kids packed in 2 small rooms. Children were pulled from school to work because the parents simply couldn't earn enough in the 100-hour work week they worked. Saturday morning cartoons were essential for anyone 12 and under. Later on I know, but I remember looking forward to the Sunday paper cause the comics were in color. The judge. The things that we do out of context, and don't understand what we mean when we say that's the way things were back then. I grew up hearing stories of my uncles, driving home, drunk from the bar, and they were always told in a funny context. Then we started to realize as society that this was a real problem and worked to change that habit, or at least make people understand it's a bad idea. Not once did I ever look back on my uncles and think they are assholes for driving home drunk. It was just the way things were back then. I recently heard someone mention how domestic abuse or just smacking a woman around was so common in old shows and movies. Think about men slapping hysterical women or one of these days, Alice. How brown the 80s was. Everything, furniture, cars, wall paneling, everything was brown. I think movies give the idea that everyone wore neon and was snorting coke in the 80s. It's like assuming everyone in this decade or the late 10s is on heroin or fentanyl. There was a lot of coke being snorted, more so in bars and clubs and somewhat of a Friday night atmosphere. And coke got popular in the white collar industry and Chicago Board of Trade members. It was far-reaching in age demographics. At first nobody really knew how addictive it was. It was somewhat accepted by the crowd. And with the white collar community, not a lot crime associated with cocaine because people using it were working and had money. When the user escalates to crack, this is a much more serious issue. Halloween used to be a truly magical night. It's a shame kids don't get to experience that anymore. A lot of the time you were bored shitless. In the UK, TV had 3 channels, and most houses had 1 TV. If someone in the house was watching something you weren't interested in, then that entertainment avenue was gone. You had radio, of course, and that was much more important in my early years. Books and comics too. But I still remember hours and hours of complete and utter boredom. Child of the 1970s here. From Los Angeles. I remember serial killers being a real thing, and the fear of serial killers. Also, how many perverts that were out there molesting children. Lot of young adults seem to think past generations didn't struggle. I'm a old millennial. I've had a few gens folks scoff at me and tell me how great everything was in the 80s and 90s and minimum wage was livable. Yet that's why half my friends were on state lunches, didn't have food every night, basically had nothing, and their parents were paycheck to paycheck and desperate not to lose their apt etc. And I know what 3.50 4.50 an hour provided from minimum wage, and it wouldn't have even covered half of rent in all but the worst areas. There was not something like a computer or the World Wide Web. Information moved slowly and whole areas of industry were dedicated moving information around on paper. That people had more spending money. Most families had maybe 1 car to share. People didn't have their own room. Hardly anyone traveled unless it was to stay with relatives for free after a grueling 1,000-mile drives with no account. Expectations for lifestyle weren't as high. Almost never eating at restaurants. Mortgage rates were high in the 80s and 90s. There was one point in 1990 where they were 15%. That Y2K fashion was even remotely as attractive as it's portrayed now. People have forgotten just how shit the economy was in the 80s and 90s until 1996 or so, when the dot-com boom was starting. They also forget just how awful 2002 was. I dare you to find someone that didn't have a plan in the 80s post Red Dawn what they would do in school when the Russians landed. Just because blue-collar workers in TV shows had big beautiful houses doesn't mean a single income retail worker could buy a 4-bedroom house. Ever.